The Zeverick dropped out of FTL like a beast emerging from the abyss, its dark, insectoid hull gleaming against the distant starlight. It was a Selvari hunter-killer, built for precision strikes and planetary purges. Against humanity's ragtag fleet, it was an executioner's blade. Admiral Voss watched from the Indomitable's bridge, his jaw clenched. How much longer until we have full fuel transfer? 7 minutes, sir, an officer replied, his voice strained. Voss didn't have 7 minutes. The Zeverick's weapons systems came online, its energy cannons charging with a sinister red glow. A single volley would be enough to cripple the Indomitable, leaving the rest of the fleet defenseless. Captain Mira Lang's voice crackled over the comms. Admiral, we're moving on the Zeverick now. Voss glanced at the tactical display. Lang's strike team had already left the station, launching from the docking bay in stolen Selvari dropships. They were heading straight for the enemy vessel. It was reckless. It was insane. It was exactly what humanity needed. Lang braced herself as the dropship lurched, dodging a pulse of enemy fire. The Zeverick was already reacting, its point defense turrets locking onto them. Decker, cut the engines as we approach, Lang barked. The dropship's thrusters went cold, sending them into a silent drift. The enemy turrets adjusted, but too late. The humans crashed onto the Zeverick's ventral hull, maglocks securing their entry. Breach in 10 seconds, Decker said, placing the charges on the airlock. Lang gripped her rifle. They had only one shot at this. If they failed, the Zeverick would cut through their fleet like a scythe through wheat. The explosives blew inward, and Lang led the charge. Inside, the Selvari crew reacted with panicked hisses, scrambling for weapons. Lang's team didn't hesitate. Plasma fire ripped through the corridors, cutting down the first wave of resistance. Move fast, Lang shouted. We need that bridge before they lock us out. Decker and his squad peeled off to secure engineering while Lang and the rest of the team pushed forward. The Zeverick's interior was dimly lit, pulsing with eerie blue veins of energy. The ship felt alive, like they were inside the belly of a beast. They reached the command deck just as the emergency blast doors started to close. Lang dove forward, wedging a detonation pack into the gap. It exploded, sending molten shrapnel flying. Inside, the Selvari captain stood tall, a towering creature of black chitin and cruel, glistening eyes. It hissed in fury. You are vermin, it spat in broken human tongue. Your kind was meant to die. Lang leveled her rifle at its chest. Yeah, guess we didn't get the memo. She pulled the trigger. The Selvari captain collapsed, and with it, the last obstacle to taking the ship. Bridge secure, Lang reported. Decker, what's your status? Decker's voice came back, triumphant. Engineering is ours. This thing is running on full power. Lang grinned. Then let's turn it against them. Massive Selvari warships loomed over Earth's shattered remains, their dark hulls blotting out the sun. Cities once teeming with life were now craters of molten ruin, their skeletal remains reaching toward the heavens like the fingers of the dead. The bombardment had been swift, merciless. Billions were gone in the blink of an eye, reduced to dust, before they could even understand what was happening. Humanity, once a rising force among the stars, had been declared unworthy of existence. Admiral Elias Voss stood in the command center of Titan Base, his fists clenched behind his back as he watched the destruction unfold through the reinforced observation window. The last transmission from Earth had gone silent 2 hours ago. London, Moscow, Beijing, New York, all were gone. His home, his people, his family. The weight of it crushed down on him like a collapsing star. A voice crackled over the intercom. Admiral, we've lost contact with the Pacific Fleet. The Selvari have deployed planet scorers to finish the surface. There's nothing left to save. Voss closed his eyes for a brief moment. He had known this day would come. For years, he had warned the United Earth Council that the Dominion would not tolerate humanity's expansion, that diplomacy was a lie they told to keep humanity weak. No one had listened, and now the cost was beyond comprehension. "We're the last ones left," said Captain Mira Lang, stepping beside him. Her face was streaked with grime and blood, her dark eyes filled with the same burning fury he felt inside. "The colonies are either wiped out or under siege. We're it, Admiral." Voss turned from the window, his expression hard as steel. "Then we make our stand." Lang exhaled sharply. "With what? We've got maybe 24 ships in fighting condition, and none of them can match even a single Xelvari dreadnought. The Fireborn initiative is still in prototype stages. We need time." "We don't have time," Voss snapped, but not at her, at the brutal reality of their situation. "If we stay here, they'll find us, and then humanity is truly finished." Silence filled the room. Around them, officers and engineers worked frantically, coordinating the last survivors, trying to establish contact with any remnants of their fleet. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They weren't an army. They were prey, scrambling in the dark, hoping the hunter would pass them by. Voss turned back to Lang. "We need to go dark, scatter, regroup, and then we hit back so hard they'll wish they left us alone." Lang's lips curled into a grim smile. "A suicide mission, then." Voss met her gaze. "No, a war, and we're going to win it." Somewhere in the distance, Titan base trembled under a distant impact. The Xelvari were coming, and humanity was far from finished. The stars stretched into thin lines as the fleet slipped into faster-than-light travel, fleeing the doomed Sol system. Titan base was gone, reduced to rubble by the Xelvari's final orbital strikes. Earth, the birthplace of humanity, was nothing more than a scorched wasteland. But they had escaped, and as long as they were still breathing, the war was not over. Admiral Elias Voss stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, humanity's last functioning battleship. The sleek, war-scarred vessel had survived countless engagements, though not without damage. Her armor was pockmarked with plasma burns, her hull barely holding together after Titan's evacuation. They had lost everything, but what remained was fire. A fire that would consume the Xelvari Empire from the inside out. Captain Mira Lang stepped up beside him, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the star charts. "We need a real plan, Admiral. We can't keep running." Voss nodded, eyes fixed on the holographic projection of their sector. Their numbers were bleak: 17 ships, 5 barely operational. Only 3 had functional weapons. They were not a fleet. They were survivors. But survivors could still start a war. He pointed at a marked location on the map, a forgotten mining outpost on the edges of neutral space. "This is Outpost Blackstone. It's small, lightly defended, and most importantly, it's where the Xelvari refuel their warships before long-range jumps. If we take it, we get fuel, supplies, and a real chance," Lang finished, a slow grin spreading across her face. Voss turned to the crew. "We hit them hard, take what we need, and disappear before reinforcements arrive. We don't have the numbers for a full engagement, so we fight like hell and leave nothing standing." Any objections? No one spoke. There was no room for doubt anymore. The attack came without warning. Outpost Blackstone hung in the darkness, its defenses minimal, only a few automated turrets and a handful of Xelvari patrol ships. Not enough to stop what was coming. The Indomitable led the charge, its railguns firing precise, devastating rounds that tore through the station's outer defenses. Explosions rippled through the docking bays as human strike teams breached the facility, their weapons blazing in the tight corridors. Captain Lang was the first through the breach. Her team moved with lethal precision, cutting down Xelvari guards before they could sound a full alarm. Plasma bolts scorched the walls. Grenades sent alien bodies tumbling through the air. But the humans pressed forward. They reached the command center in minutes. Lang leveled her rifle at the trembling Xelvari officer at the controls. "Shut down the distress beacons. Now." The alien hesitated for a fraction of a second. That was a mistake. Lang pulled the trigger. The Selvari collapsed, and her second-in-command, Sergeant Decker, shoved the body aside to access the terminal. Beacons are down. We're clear for the transfer. Across the station, engineers scrambled to siphon fuel and loot supplies. Every second counted. They needed to be gone before anyone realized what had happened. But fate had other plans. A warning light flared red on Decker's console. Incoming ships. Selvari warship Zevarek dropping out of FTL. Lang's blood ran cold. A single Selvari warship could wipe them out in their current state. They were outgunned, outnumbered. Unless they stole the Zevarek first. She turned to her team. Change of plans. We're taking that ship. And just like that, the Fireborn rebellion had begun. The stolen Zevarek drifted in the void, its black hull now marked with fresh battle scars. Where once it had been a symbol of Selvari dominance, it was now the first true weapon of the Fireborn rebellion. Admiral Elias Voss stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching the ship through the viewport. The humans had done the impossible. They had taken one of the enemy's own war machines and turned it against them. But it wasn't enough. "Status report," he said, his voice low but firm. Lieutenant Rains, the fleet's chief analyst, studied the data before her. The Zevarek's systems are still largely intact. Captain Lang's team managed to secure most of the weapons and power core. We've uploaded a new command interface, so it's under our control. She hesitated. But we can't replicate this. We got lucky, Admiral. The next Selvari ship won't go down so easily. Voss exhaled, staring at the tactical map. Their fleet had grown by one, but the enemy had thousands. If they were to survive. No, if they were to win. They needed more than stolen ships. They needed an army. His gaze settled on a distant system on the map. A red marker pulsed over the rust-colored planet of Mars. "The old Turan war forges," Voss murmured. Rains looked up, eyes widening. "Sir, those facilities have been abandoned for decades. The last of the Martian industry shut down after the war with the Unity Coalition. Abandoned, yes, but not useless." Voss turned to his officers. Mars was once the heart of human war production. If even a fraction of those facilities are operational, we might have a chance to rebuild. A moment of silence passed as the officers absorbed his plan. Then Lang's voice came over the comms from the Zevarek. "Mars, huh?" she said. "Hell of a gamble, Admiral." "We don't have a choice," Voss replied. "Set course. If the Selvari want a war, we'll give them one." 3 days later, the fleet arrived in orbit over Mars. The planet was a graveyard of rusted machines and forgotten history. Once, it had been the center of human expansion, a place where warships were forged and armies were born. Now, it was little more than a husk, its cities buried beneath centuries of dust. Lang and her strike team landed first, moving through the abandoned tunnels of the Olympus Mons Forge complex. The facility was massive, its halls echoing with the ghosts of the past. The power grid was barely functional, its reactors slumbering beneath layers of dust and ice. But the machines were still there, waiting. Lang wiped her visor clean and activated her comm. "We've got something here, Admiral. The Forge's automated systems are intact, but they're running in low-power mode." Voss's voice came through the static. "Can you bring them back online?" Lang turned to her engineer, Lieutenant Casimir, who was already working at an ancient control panel. Sparks flew as he forced the interface to comply. The ground rumbled. Lights flickered on, one by one, illuminating the massive halls. Then, with a deafening roar, the forges of Mars awoke. Machines long thought dead began to stir. Conveyor systems rumbled to life. Robotic arms twitched, and dormant assembly lines shuddered into motion. The facility, built to supply the armies of old Earth, was waking up to a new war. Lang grinned. "I think we just found our war machine." But before they could celebrate, Casimir swore. "Incoming transmission. Encrypted Selvari frequency." Voss's voice was sharp. "They found us." An alert flared across the fleet's displays. Multiple Xelvari warships had just dropped out of FTL. The enemy had come to finish what they started, and humanity had to hold the line long enough for Mars to rise again. The Xelvari fleet arrived like a swarm of locusts, their ships slipping out of FTL in tight formation. There were 5 of them, 2 frigates, a heavy cruiser, and 2 destroyers, each bristling with weapons. Against humanity's makeshift fleet, it was overwhelming firepower. Admiral Elias Voss stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, his hands gripping the railing as red alert sirens blared around him. Weapons online, Lieutenant Rains reported. They'll be in firing range in 2 minutes. Voss didn't respond immediately. His mind was already calculating, running through every possible strategy. They couldn't outrun the enemy, and they certainly couldn't win in a straight fight. But they didn't need to. "Mira, what's your status?" he asked over the comms. Captain Mira Lang's voice came back, tight with urgency. "We're working as fast as we can. The forges are coming online, but we need more time to get the automated defenses operational." Voss turned to his officers. "Then we buy them that time." The battle erupted in an instant. The Indomitable fired first, its railguns sending kinetic slugs ripping through the void. One of the Xelvari frigates took the hit, its shields flaring before one of the rounds breached the hull, sending a plume of flame and debris into space. The Zevarek, now under human control, turned its stolen weapons on its former masters, unleashing a barrage of energy blasts. The enemy was caught off guard. The Xelvari hadn't expected their own ship to turn against them, but they recovered quickly. The Xelvari destroyers returned fire, sending waves of plasma bolts streaking toward the human fleet. One of the smaller human corvettes took a direct hit, its hull splitting apart in a silent explosion. "Damn it," Voss snarled. "Keep moving. We can't let them pin us down." The Indomitable and its remaining escorts weaved through the battlefield, striking fast before darting away. They were outgunned, but they were fighting like cornered wolves, desperate, vicious, and unpredictable. Still, the enemy pressed forward, tightening their grip. If Lang and her team didn't bring the Martian defenses online soon, the battle would be lost. Inside the Olympus Mons Forge complex, Lang sprinted through the cavernous hallways, her boots kicking up dust as she ran. She could hear the distant rumble of explosions from the battle above. "Casimir," she shouted, "tell me we got something." The engineer was frantically typing at a control panel, sweat dripping from his forehead. Almost there. The auto defense network was in deep standby. These systems haven't been touched in 100 years. Lang gritted her teeth, then waked them up. A final keystroke. A deep mechanical groan echoed through the facility as the old war machines of Mars fully awakened. Massive gun emplacements, buried beneath the surface for decades, began to rise. Turrets the size of buildings emerged from the Martian sands, their barrels rotating toward the sky. Then they fired. The first barrage struck one of the Xelvari frigates, shearing it in half before it could react. The second volley slammed into the destroyers, sending shockwaves through their shields. On the Indomitable, Voss watched as the tide of battle shifted. A slow, predatory smile formed on his lips. Now we fight. The war for humanity had truly begun. The Martian war machines roared to life, their ancient cannons vomiting fire into the sky. The sands trembled with every blast as long-dormant defense turrets tracked and engaged the Xelvari fleet. One of the Xelvari destroyers took a direct hit to its engines, its aft section erupting into a molten fireball. It spiraled out of control, slamming into the Martian surface with a cataclysmic explosion that sent shockwaves across the barren plains. On the Indomitable's bridge, Admiral Elias Voss watched the battlefield shift. The enemy fleet, once confident in its overwhelming firepower, was suddenly on the defensive. Their tight formation had become a liability, making them easy targets for the planet's resurrected defenses. Voss turned to his crew. "Press the attack. Don't let them regroup." The Indomitable surged forward, its railguns firing in synchronized bursts. The stolen Zevarak, now fully under human control, flanked the enemy, hammering them with their own weaponry. The Excelivary, caught between the relentless assault from Mars and the fireborne fleet, hesitated for the first time. Then they began to retreat. Inside the Olympus Mons Forge complex, Captain Mira Lang wiped sweat from her brow, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The ancient Martian systems had done their job. The automated defenses had turned the tide, but she knew this was only a temporary victory. "They're pulling back," Decker reported, watching the Selvari ships break formation. "But they'll be back with reinforcements." Lang nodded, "Which means we don't have much time." She turned to Casimir, who was still working furiously at a control terminal. "How much of the forge can we get operational?" Casimir exhaled. "It's old, but it's not dead. The primary assembly lines are coming online. If we can get raw materials, we can start production." He hesitated. "But what do we build?" Lang looked around the massive complex. This was once the beating heart of humanity's war industry. Battleships, weapons, and war machines had been forged here, meant to wage war on Earth's enemies. Now, it would serve a new purpose. She activated her comm. "Admiral, the forge is ours. Give me a list of priorities." Voss's voice came through without hesitation. "We need ships, weapons, and soldiers. We need to turn this planet into a fortress." Lang nodded. "Then we get to work." Hours passed. The Selvari fleet had fully withdrawn, but Voss knew it was only temporary. They had underestimated humanity before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Inside the war room aboard the Indomitable, Voss, Lang, and the senior officers gathered around a holographic display of Mars. "This is our stronghold now," Voss said, his voice steady. "The Excelivary will come back, and when they do, they'll bring everything they have." He looked at Lang. "How soon can we have warships in the sky?" Lang glanced at Casimir, who crossed his arms. "If we can keep the forge running. A week for the first batch of combat-ready ships, maybe less if we push the systems to the limit." Voss turned back to the display, his expression grim but determined. "Then we prepare," he said, "because this isn't just about survival anymore." He clenched his fists. "We're taking the fight to them." The once dead forges of Mars now roared with renewed purpose. Conveyor belts carried slabs of raw metal into massive assembly lines, robotic arms welding, cutting, and shaping them into the skeletal frames of warships. Sparks cascaded like fiery rain, illuminating the underground factories where the first fleet of humanity's rebirth was taking shape. Captain Mira Lang stood on an elevated platform, watching the first hull plating being secured onto the skeletal framework of a new warship, HS's Vengeance. The name had been Casimir's idea. Fitting, given everything that Selvari had done. "We've got 5 ships nearing completion," Casimir reported, wiping grime from his face. "Smaller than the Indomitable, but fast, heavily armed, and more are on the way." Lang nodded. "And the soldiers?" Decker, her second in command, answered this time. "We're training every able body we can find. Former smugglers, ex-mers, even civilians. They're raw, but they're willing." His expression darkened. The Excelivary didn't leave anyone with the luxury of staying out of this fight. Lang turned back to the warships under construction. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were preparing to strike back. Aboard the Indomitable, Admiral Elias Voss studied the latest intelligence reports. The Selvari had pulled back, but their movements suggested a massive fleet was amassing just beyond the system. Their retreat hadn't been out of fear. It had been tactical. The next battle wouldn't be a skirmish. It would be a war. Lieutenant Rains entered, datapad in hand. "New reports from our recon probes. The Selvari are mobilizing in the Dracos expanse. Fleet size unknown, but if they're gathering there, it means they're preparing for an invasion." Voss exhaled slowly. "And how long until they're ready?" Rains hesitated. "Maybe a week. Maybe less. Voss looked out at Mars, its surface now crawling with renewed industrial activity. A week wasn't long enough. They needed more ships, more weapons, more time. But waiting wasn't an option. He turned to the holographic display, bringing up a star map. "We're not waiting for them to come to us," he said. "We take the fight to them." Lang's voice crackled over the comm. "Admiral, are you seriously suggesting an assault on the Excelveri fleet before they're fully prepared?" Voss nodded. "It's the only way we win. We hit them at the Dracos Expanse, cripple their command structure before they can bring their full force to bear." His eyes narrowed. "We turn their own tactics against them." A moment of silence. Then Lang chuckled. "Damn, you really are as crazy as they say." Voss allowed himself a small smile. "Is that a complaint, Captain?" "Hell no," Lang said. "Just making sure I've got enough ammo." 3 days later, the Fireborn fleet departed Mars. 5 newly forged warships led the charge, flanked by the Indomitable and the stolen Zevarak. Their numbers were still few, but they carried something that Excelveri didn't understand: vengeance. As they jumped into FTL, the galaxy would soon learn what happened when humanity refused to die. The Fireborn fleet emerged from FTL in the Dracos Expanse, space rippling as their warships tore into real space. Before them stretched the amassed Excelveri Armada. Dozens of warships clustered in tight formation, their weapons powered down, unaware of the storm about to descend upon them. Admiral Elias Voss stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, his face carved from stone. This was the moment. Humanity's last desperate gamble. "All ships, prepare to engage," he ordered. Across the fleet, crews braced for battle. The newly forged warships from Mars, smaller but faster than their Excelveri counterparts, maneuvered into attack positions. The stolen Zevarak, now painted with human battle insignias, activated its plasma arrays. The Excelveri hadn't expected an attack. They thought humanity would cower, that they would wait for Extinction to come knocking. They were wrong. The first strike came like lightning from the void. Railguns from the Indomitable launched kinetic rounds at relativistic speeds, hammering the closest Excelveri cruiser. The rounds tore through its shields, splitting its hull open in a silent explosion. At the same moment, the Martian warships accelerated into the heart of the Excelveri fleet, their plasma cannons vomiting fire. The Vengeance and her sister ships wove between enemy vessels, striking with ruthless efficiency before darting away, too fast for the lumbering Excelveri warships to pin down. The enemy scrambled to respond. Alarm klaxons blared across the Excelveri fleet as their warships scrambled into formation. Plasma bolts seared through space, cutting dangerously close to the Fireborn ships. Captain Mira Lang, piloting the Zevarak, twisted the alien warship through the chaos. "They're mobilizing faster than expected," she barked over the comms. "We won't be able to keep up this hit and run forever." Voss knew it too. The Excelveri still outnumbered them 10-1. They needed a killing blow, something that would break the enemy completely. Then it hit him. "Lang, do you still have control of the Zevarak's self-destruct protocols?" There was a pause. Then Lang's voice came back, slow and deliberate. "Yeah, I do." Voss's eyes locked onto the flagship of the Excelveri fleet, a towering dreadnought sitting at the center of their formation. He pointed at it. "Ram that thing straight into their flagship and detonate." Silence. Then a low chuckle. "Damn, Admiral," Lang said. "You really don't do half measures." She turned to her crew. "Everyone, evac to escape pods. Now." As the battle raged, escape pods burst from the Zevarak, streaking toward Allied ships. Lang remained at the helm, her hands steady on the controls. She pushed the ship's engines to their limit, sending the stolen Excelveri warship hurtling toward their flagship. The Excelveri, realizing what was happening, fired everything they had. Plasma and railgun fire scorched the Zevarak's hull, but Lang held course. She smiled grimly as the enemy dreadnought loomed larger in the viewport. "For Earth," She slammed her fist onto the manual detonation switch. The Zevarek erupted in a sun-bright explosion. The shockwave tore through the Selvari flagship, cracking it open like a shattered skull. The force of the detonation sent debris and energy rippling outward, consuming multiple enemy ships caught in the blast radius. The Selvari fleet, leaderless and in disarray, faltered. Voss seized the moment. All ships pressed the attack. The Fireborn fleet surged forward, relentless, without their flagship's command structure. The Selvari warships fought desperately but without cohesion. One by one, they fell, until the survivors flowed into the depths of space. The battle was over. Humanity had won. Aboard the Indomitable, Voss stood in the command center, staring at the wreckage of the Selvari fleet. His crew cheered, but he remained still. Lang had given everything for this victory. A transmission crackled through the comms. "Ind me a damn drink, Admiral." Voss's head snapped up. Lang's escape pod had been recovered. For the first time in a long while, Voss smiled. He turned to his officers. "Set course back to Mars. We have a war to finish." The Fireborn had risen, and the galaxy would never forget.